Hey, it's Mr. Soderberg, and we're talking about the Articles of Confederation, which I think many people don't realize was that the first Constitution of the United States was the Articles of Confederation. It was around from 1777 to 1781, and that's way before the one that we have now, which came around in 1789. So the Articles of Confederation, first U.S. Constitution. I think that one of the most important things to understand about the Articles of Confederation and why we would talk about it is centered on the debate between the balance of power between the federal or the central or the national government and the state governments. Um, when the Articles of Confederation were first created, it was in the middle of the American Revolution. They were created in 1777. And so the question becomes, how can we run a government that looks as different from a monarchy as possible? We had a king. We didn't like it. We were trying to break free from Great Britain, and in doing so, we had to create a separate government that doesn't have any of those abuses that we were rebelling against. All right, we were looking for something called limited government, or at least limited federal or central or national government. All right, so limited government. Um, you've probably heard me say federal, central, or national. Central government, it's synonymous with federal government. All right, and what we wanted is we wanted to have a very, very small role for the federal government. In fact, under the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have an executive branch. We didn't have a president, right? We were getting away from having a king. We were worried, when I say we, I mean founding fathers, um, those old guys, they were worried about a president becoming too powerful. We also didn't have any federal courts. We left that up to the states. The only thing that we had, the only thing that the U.S. government, the federal government had, was a legislative body, and that was Congress. Ooh, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. 9 out of 13. New law. Well, let's talk about that. We had a Congress. The Congress was made up of all 13 states, which were formerly the 13 colonies. Every state had one representative. And in order to make a new law, 9 out of the 13 states had to agree with one another. Even more difficult, if you wanted to amend, if you wanted to make a formal change to the Articles of Confederation, you had to have 13 out of 13 states agreeing with each other to amend the Articles. That's very hard to do. Very hard to do. See, we were trying to make sure that all the states were represented equally. But to pass a law, you had to have 9 of the 13 states agreeing, and 13 out of the 13 states agreeing to amend the Articles of Constitution. So if you can imagine sitting in a room with 12 other people, and you have to agree upon one pizza topping for the rest of your life, it would be almost impossible to do. Amending the Articles of Confederation, forget about it. 13 out of 13, I don't know if we would have ever lived to see that day. I don't think it could ever happen. All right, so there are some positives regarding the Articles of Confederation. It did do some good for us early in this period. The biggest thing that it did is it united all 13 colonies, who are now the 13 states, into one country. At the end of the American Revolution, we were also able to pass the Treaty of Paris that, they negotiated with Britain to end the Revolutionary War with the Articles of Confederation. So we had that treaty that got done under the Articles of Confederation. Also, we had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and the Northwest Ordinance outlines for the country how the U.S. is going to expand as it or if it moves west. And we do know from history that we did expand west. And when I say we, I mean the United States. The real problem with the Articles of Confederation that there were a lot of things that the U.S. still had to figure out as they were growing. There were a lot of growing pains. I talked about the Treaty of Paris and how we were able to negotiate that treaty with Britain. But other than that, we were still kind of getting pushed around by Britain afterwards. We were unable to negotiate, or I would say, more importantly, we were unable to enforce any treaties that we signed as a country. For instance, Britain did not allow the U.S. to trade with Canada or the West Indies. They did allow us to send resources to them on American ships. And there were also some forts that were in the Northwest, British military forts, and they just flat out refused to vacate those forts. So we got out from under the thumb of the king, but we were still kind of getting pushed around by Britain. To fight the war with Britain and to eventually win the war, we had to borrow. The colonial government had to borrow a great deal of money from France, and Benjamin Franklin was the colonist who negotiated most of these loans. And back then they totaled about $2 million, which, if you think about it today, this isn't even in today money. In 213, 1776, $2 million is equal to over $50 million in 2013. So it's a lot of money. And how are we going to pay that back? Well, we had some options. We could either borrow more money to pay off France and run our own country, or we could print more money. Printing more money could lead to hyperinflation, where the value of the dollar decreases greatly and very quickly. Got ahead of myself here again, I'm sorry. I should point out that borrowing money meant borrowing money from other foreign countries or from individual states. And I say that today and it seems kind of backwards. It seems like the federal government borrowing money from states almost sounds like parents asking their kids for an allowance. Just seems strange. I guess a third option would be to sell off federal land. So after the Revolutionary War, remember that the Revolutionary War, a lot of it was fought because of what they felt was unjust taxation. The United States government was not allowed to collect taxes from citizens. And that's kind of interesting because we did collect taxes from the colonies during the Revolutionary War, but a lot of times these colonies and later on the states refused to pay back their back taxes. Massachusetts owed the government like $41 million. Pennsylvania owed the government over $120 million. If states did pay their taxes, it was their citizens that were paying the taxes, right? So if you were a citizen living in a state that was paying its taxes to the federal government, you could expect that 33% of your income was going to get taxed. So 33 cents out of every dollar you made was going to go to the federal government. Some people's taxes during the course of 12 years, increased by over 1,000%. And that is kind of crazy when you think about it. Now, the U.S. printed so much money that it was virtually worthless. It wasn't worth the paper that it was printed on. The colonial dollar was worth like 1/40th of 1 cent in silver or gold. So that would be like taking a penny and cutting it into 40 equal pieces. The colonial dollar would be worth one out of those 40 pieces. Um, Most merchants back then wouldn't even take colonial money. Instead, they wanted silver or gold. So the Articles of Confederation, as I said, created a Congress. It had the power to declare war, appoint military officers, sign treaties, make alliances, appoint foreign ambassadors, manage relations with American Indian tribes. However, it was hard to do anything with an underfunded military. Congress could not tax the states. So one rebellion was fended off only after wealthy merchants pooled enough of their money to pay soldiers. So in other words, a rebellion was going on. Soldiers weren't going to do anything about it because they weren't getting paid. So a bunch of wealthy merchants, wealthy citizens, essentially passed the hat around and filled it up with money so that the soldiers would take the rebellion out. And that's pretty crazy stuff. So what led to us just finally realizing that we need to abandon these Articles of Confederation in favor of a different constitution? Well, the inciting incident is something known as Shays' Rebellion. And we're not going to learn about it today necessarily, but later on in a different assignment, we're going to look at Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion happened in Massachusetts. It was a group of farmers led by a guy named Daniel Shays. What happened is that after the Revolutionary War was done, a lot of people who had fought in the Revolutionary War weren't given any of their payment for their duty. Right? The government owed them money and they weren't paying it. States were also, people that lived in places like Massachusetts, they were facing really high taxes. So Daniel Shay and these farmers were really upset. Obviously, they wanted their money, and so they started rebelling. But the problem is, with the way that the central government was built, first, Congress had no ability to collect taxes to pay these people. And if it couldn't collect taxes, couldn't pay back the farmers their money, and they didn't have any money to create a military. So each state had to have their own militia. The United States as a whole did not have a military to suppress this rebellion. So on both sides, we were in a really bad situation politically. So in 1787, the leaders of the United States got together and said, all right, the Articles of Confederation aren't working anymore. We're going to need a stronger central government. Even though we are trying to get away from the monarchy of Britain, we need to think of something that's going to work a little bit better for us, because not having a strong enough central government just isn't working. It's not the answer. All right, so that in a nutshell is the ups and downs and ins and outs of the Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution.